I'm Doug Boynton, and you're listening to WHRO's Weekly Edition, where we highlight the week's news and stories happening in our area, which has seen some cold and snowy weather lately. In this week's program, we'll take a look at Perdue Farms, now facing a big penalty from the U.S. Department of Labor after children were found working in hazardous conditions. Virginia churches might soon have an easier path to develop affordable housing, and a new alliance to talk about. Norfolk State University is teaming up with the Elizabeth River Project to help marginalized communities impacted by climate change.
You can help clean up the creeks and the waterways, but we've seen them cleaned up before, and it's like a one and done.
It's WHRO's Weekly Edition. Hope you're staying warm this week. It looks like the General Assembly is back at the table considering whether to fund a study of menhaden in the Chesapeake Bay. With that, WHRO's Catherine Hafner reports on what it will take to move forward.
Menhaden are a tiny fish with big impact. Recreational fishermen and environmentalists have been concerned that declines in the menhaden population are affecting species like osprey and striped bass that rely on them as a food source. The menhaden harvest industry, meanwhile, maintains that the fish are doing perfectly fine. Delegate Paul Milday, a Republican from Stafford County, is sponsoring legislation that would help settle the debate with a 3-year study of menhaden in the Chesapeake Bay. The Virginia Institute of Marine Science has already mapped out the scope of the study, which would cost just shy of $3 million. But last year, lawmakers decided not to act on it. Catherine Hafner, WHRO News.
Perdue Farms was in a heap of trouble after the U.S. Department of Labor found children working in hazardous conditions in the company's Accomac facility. It was some costly news for them. WHRO's Ryan Murphy reports the company will pay more than $4 million in fines.
Perdue's payments will go to the affected children and advocates for victims of child labor exploitation. Perdue and contractor SMX will also each pay a $125,000 civil penalty. Both companies also agreed to conditions including not hiring minors in certain locations, providing mandatory child labor training for managers and employees, and establishing a tip line for employees to report compliance issues. In 2024, Department of Labor investigators found Perdue and SMX employed children as far back as 2020 in what it called hazardous conditions at Perdue's Accomac plant. The children were deboning and processing chicken and other products using electric knives and a heat sealing press. They were also found to be working until after 7 p.m. during school weeks in violation of federal child labor laws. Ryan Murphy, WHRO News.
Another partnership to mention this week, Hampton's Phoebus Partnership and Newport News Hilton Village Main Street are sharing some rare company as the latest to reach the top tier of the Virginia Main Street program. WHRO's Nick McNamara reported the story.
Joe Griffith, Virginia Main Street manager for the Phoebus Partnership, says the program has helped Phoebus breathe new life into its historic buildings. J.B. Crowley, Hilton Village Main Street executive director, says it's helped secure funds to create redevelopment strategies for its historic resources as well. And it's also helped with strategies to guide best practices for things like public art and creative placemaking.
They had strong local government support and strong neighborhood support. They had that strong public-private partnership and the willingness to make progress for the future.
That's Virginia Main Street State Coordinator Courtney Maley. Virginia Main Street says collectively, areas with participating local programs generated upwards of $2.6 billion in public and private investment. Nick McNamara, WHRO News.
Also happening, churches might soon be able to develop affordable housing. It is an interesting concept. WHRO's Ryan Murphy explains the proposed state law.
Legislation from 2 Richmond area senators would allow cities and counties to waive fees and expedite zoning and permitting for faith-based nonprofits seeking to build affordable housing. Sharon Schoaf with the City of Virginia Beach's Housing Office says that could help clear some obstacles, though others remain, like dealing with complicated tax credits. Still, cities like Virginia Beach have increasingly looked to religious groups as part of a multi-pronged effort to tackle the affordability crisis.
They have a mission that's in alignment with providing this type of service to the community.
Some churches in Northern Virginia have already started work on their own developments. Virginia Beach put out a call last year to see if any local religious groups wanted to step into housing. 4 responded, one of which Schoaf says looks to have real promise. Ryan Murphy, WHRO News.
On the political and somewhat local front, outgoing President Joe Biden pardoned several Virginians in his last days in office, including Speaker of the House of Delegates Don Scott of Portsmouth. WHRO's Michelle Hankerson brings us that story.
Scott was convicted of a nonviolent drug offense in 1994. He served 8 years for it and became an attorney once he left prison. In a press release, Biden wrote Scott's supporters praise his remorse and redemption and dedication to public service. Presidential pardons don't clear records. They are formal expressions of forgiveness and can help people convicted of felonies get some rights back. Scott's rights were restored in 2013 under former Republican Governor Bob McDonnell. Biden also pardoned Kemba Pradia of Northern Virginia, whose 1994 drug offense was commuted in 2000 by former President Bill Clinton. Biden granted clemency to 2 men who have been jailed since 1998 for killing a Sussex County police officer. They were acquitted of the murder, but still sentenced to life in prison. The order means they will be released February 17th. Michelle Hankerson, WHRO News.
And as the new administration begins in D.C., it's time to say goodbye to new federal leasing and permitting for offshore wind energy. That was one of President Trump's first actions this week. WHRO's Catherine Hafner reports on what that could mean for Virginia.
Dominion Energy is already building the nation's largest offshore wind farm off the Virginia Beach coast. The utility says they're confident that will continue despite the new executive order, but they have not received permits for 2 additional federal lease sites, recently acquired in Virginia Beach and the Outer Banks. The company could also feel the impact in court if the federal government stops defending the Virginia project in an ongoing lawsuit from conservative interest groups. Dominion declined to comment on that. The Hampton Roads Alliance, which has worked hard to attract the local offshore wind industry, says they're closely watching how Trump's order will play out, but it's too early to say how it'll impact our region. Catherine Hafner, WHRO News.
Still ahead on Weekly Edition, building standards are becoming more strict in Hampton Roads. It's an effort to be proactive as climate change worsens. But first, members of the General Assembly are debating what kind of punishment should be on the table for people who use deep fakes to commit crimes. From the state capitol, WVTF's Michael Pope reports.
Casinos, lottery, sports betting, online gambling, charitable gaming, live horse racing, historic horse racing. There's lots of ways to get rich quick, or at least go broke trying, in Virginia these days. But as modern gaming mixes with the old, and annual revenues tick up in the billions, Virginia's legislature and Governor Glenn Youngkin want to create one authority to oversee as much of it as possible.
Let's focus our efforts this session on building a world-class regulatory body.
That's Youngkin and his State of the Commonwealth address earlier this month. The creation of the Virginia Gaming Commission, or VGC, started with a study in 2022. That led to the hiring of consulting firm Guidehouse and a series of meetings with final recommendations and bills establishing the VGC being proposed this session. Details include the consolidation of all the state's gaming options, except Virginia Lottery, under the new agency. The VGC would handle regulation and oversight, report and recommend changes to the legislature, and manage problem gambling. But as the debate over skill games and their quasi-legal proliferation continues, Senator Aaron Rouse asked who's responsible for enforcing the violation of VGC's regulations. Here's Guidehouse's Brad Hood.
And when we think about enforcement, we think about this organization focused much more on compliance. In today's ecosystem, local law enforcement and the Virginia State Police and others focus on the enforcement.
So the agency's focus on compliance would be making the regulations, but it would still be up to local and state police to bust violators. In Richmond, I'm Brad Kuttner.
Gambling, or gaming as it's sometimes referred to, amounted to more than $1.1 billion in revenue for the Commonwealth last year. And as it becomes more popular, Virginia legislators and its governor are looking to consolidate oversight of the changing landscape. Brad Kuttner of partner station WVTF has more from Richmond.
Using a synthetic voice to scam your way into someone's bank account is already a crime, but does it need a new penalty for using a new technology? Senator Adam Eben is a Democrat from Alexandria who has a bill that would create new civil and criminal penalties for using deepfakes to commit crimes.
When you have a video of someone saying something with their likeness, their voice, that looks real, it's very believable. It's a new kind of fraud.
And then why have a new penalty? Aren't there existing penalties you could use?
We want to discourage the use of deepfakes and of synthetic media to perpetuate fraud.
Senate Majority Leader Scott Sorrell says the code section Eben wants to amend is called the Insulting Word Statute, which was adopted in the early 1800s to provide a way for people to file a lawsuit instead of challenging someone to a duel.
I think that would be a crime anyway already. I don't see why just using a digital fake voice to do it means it's not a crime, which I think is what the concern is. So it's just not clear to me exactly how necessary the entire bill is.
A Senate panel stripped Eben's bill of the penalties and created a new work group to consider the issues, although there are still opportunities for Eben to bring back new penalties as the bill makes its way through the General Assembly. Reporting from the Capitol in Richmond, I'm Michael Pope.
For several years, congressional Republicans have been trying to cut efforts to fight extremism in the military. Those efforts began after the 2021 Capitol insurrection, where the crowd included troops and veterans. Now the Trump administration is poised to end those anti-extremism programs entirely. Jay Price reports for the American Homefront Project.
In his Senate confirmation hearing, Pete Hegseth, the former Fox News host who President Trump nominated for Secretary of Defense, was direct in his reply to a question from Nebraska Republican Kevin Cramer.
Things like focusing on extremism, Senator, have created a climate inside our ranks that feel political when it hasn't ever been political. Those are the types of things that are going to change.
Hegseth's hearing came 2 weeks after high-profile attacks in New Orleans and Las Vegas by men with military connections, and days after a wave of stories tied to the anniversary of the 2021 Capitol insurrection. But Hegseth said extremism in the ranks isn't a serious problem, and efforts to fight it are a distraction for the military.
That was a made-up boogeyman to begin with.
The anti-extremism initiatives were started by President Biden's Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin. Austin ordered the entire military to stand down for reflection and formed a working group that made recommendations on fighting extremism. The service branches updated their rules to better define extremism, developed training to recognize and counter it, and created systems to report it. But activists say those efforts have had limited effects that could be stalled or reversed. Heidi Byrek is a co-founder of the Global Project Against Hate and Extremism.
I do think we've lost momentum because of the politicization of the process, meaning the Pentagon has shied away from making this a centerpiece of its efforts in the last few years.
There's been some progress, she says, like an improved system to screen out recruits who may be affiliated with extremist groups or crime gangs. But Byrek says the Defense Department hasn't been transparent enough.
The fact that those rules and regulations were put in place in those branches may have a lasting impact over time, but it's very hard to know because we don't have data. And I just don't think the next 4 years are going to bode well for any kind of emphasis around this issue.
In his confirmation hearing, Hegseth cited a study commissioned by the Pentagon and released in 2023 that looked at military extremism.
100 extremists were identified in the ranks of 3 million.
That study concluded extremism was no more common among service members than civilians. But the Associated Press found the study relied on outdated data and misleading analysis. Meanwhile, the Defense Department has been funding another study by a group headquartered at the University of Maryland. Its data shows the percentage of extremists with military backgrounds who commit ideologically driven crimes has doubled in recent years.
And that is true if you include or if you exclude individuals that participated in the January 6th attack. So this appears to be a growing problem.
Michael Jensen is a senior researcher for the group, the National Consortium for the Study of Terrorism and Responses to Terrorism. It also found military service was the strongest predictor that someone would attempt a mass casualty attack and be successful at it.
It's not true that every member of the military is an extremist in the making, that every case of extremist crime is someone with a military background. But what we need to really focus on is the impact of even a single case.
Jensen said people with military backgrounds tend to be effective recruiters for extremist groups and rise quickly into leadership roles. He says the vast majority of extremist criminals with military ties are veterans, not active duty troops. His group recommends the Pentagon not only improve its efforts to fight extremism in the ranks, but also boost efforts to educate troops about how to avoid getting involved in extremism after they leave the service. I'm Jay Price, reporting.
This is WHRO's Weekly Edition. Remember, for any stories you've missed, you can visit us on the WHRO smartphone app or all social media platforms.
Climate change is changing the way Hampton Roads leaders look at local building standards. WHRO's Catherine Hafner has more on the stricter regulations that were adopted this week.
Sea level rise and heavier rainfall tied to global warming are dumping more and more water onto local roadways. That can quickly overwhelm infrastructure like storm drains that was built decades ago. Ben McFarland with the Hampton Roads Planning District Commission says when building new projects, officials need to use better data.
Making our communities more resilient really requires us to think about what it means to build for the future, and not just for yesterday or even for today.
The Commission's board approved a new set of guidelines they call Resilient Design Standards. The goal is to better account for climate impacts when building critical local infrastructure. McFarland says the standards will make things more expensive in the short term.
But also our risk is going up, so either way there is a cost.
This week's vote doesn't change anything in code. It's meant to prompt local governments to take their own action. Catherine Hafner, WHRO News.
The Accomac County School Board has agreed to take greater steps to ensure transparency after it was sued for violating the state's Freedom of Information Act. WHRO's Ryan Murphy has the details.
In the agreement filed in circuit court, the board acknowledges it violated Virginia's Freedom of Information Act, though it maintains those violations were unintentional. 4 county residents sued after the board called a special meeting in October where it fired then Superintendent Rhonda Hall. The residents claimed the board didn't give sufficient notice of the meeting to the public, didn't meet in a location where the public could watch, and advertised it as totally closed, even though public votes occurred. Most of the agreement filed in court this week relates simply to the school board following Virginia's existing public meetings law. The terms include advertising meetings accurately and at least 3 days ahead of time. It also requires the board to hold meetings in places where people can attend and specify reasons for closing meetings to the public. Ryan Murphy, WHRO News.
And we should mention Accomac County Schools is a member of HRETA, which holds the license for the WHRO stations. Suffolk decided it will allow a new 3-megawatt solar development to move forward after concerns about persistent noise stalled one solar farm project in December. WHRO's Nick McNamara reports.
City council members felt comparing the new Secretariat solar development on Crittenden Road to the Stratford solar farm on White Marsh was like comparing apples to oranges. The Secretariat project is smaller, located farther from neighbors, uses different inverters, and should be quieter. That helped draw the support of the oft-solar-opposed council member Shelley Butler Barlow.
Still not a cheerleader for solar, but I think in this instance, all the T's have been crossed and the I's have been dotted.
Some residents maintained concerns, including Shane and Tiffany Alexander, whose family was at the center of the conversation about solar farm noise on White Marsh. The Alexanders, though, were happy that new developers were doing more homework on the sonic impact of their projects. Nick McNamara, WHRO News.
Norfolk State University and the Elizabeth River Project are teaming up to work on a model for helping historically marginalized communities affected by environmental issues. WHRO's Catherine Hafner reports.
It's a cold winter morning, but Jay Boone is bundled up and ready to work. Outside the Berkeley Community Center in Norfolk, she waters rows of plants in raised wooden garden beds.
So we have about 3 different types of collards out here. We have cabbage, we have Brussels sprouts, broccoli, kale.
This community garden is one of Boone's major achievements with her Southside organization called CUSP, or Keeping Us Secure and Prosperous.
More than anything, we needed community building, but we needed places that people could go to access fresh produce options.
The garden grew out of a partnership including Norfolk State University and the nonprofit Elizabeth River Project. It's part of their larger initiative called an Environmental Justice Incubator. History professor Cassandra Newby-Alexander says it's a chance to dive into the roots of the issues.
You can help clean up the creeks and the waterways, but we've seen them cleaned up before, and it's like a one and done. What hasn't been done is let's get at the systemic issues going on.
The federal government defines environmental justice as equal treatment of all people when making decisions related to the environment. Advocates raise issues like polluting facilities deliberately built in communities of color, or flooding in vulnerable areas that cuts off access during storms. But Newby-Alexander says to work toward justice, officials first need to look backward. For example, maybe those neighborhoods have limited access because they were purposefully segregated by highway infrastructure.
In order to fix a problem, you have to first acknowledge how the problem got to be a problem. And then you have to engage in some reparative justice.
Her team is currently working with historically Black communities on Norfolk's South Side, doing projects like their Berkeley Garden. Over the next year, the group plans to draft a list of best practices for doing environmental justice work that officials all around the country could learn from and replicate. Newby-Alexander says the biggest message is to put the community's needs and history first, instead of forcing preconceived solutions upon them.
Because if you fail to acknowledge what they've been trying to do, what they've succeeded in doing, then you have actually gone in and immediately disrespected that community.
Rue Williams is Environmental Justice Coordinator for the Elizabeth River Project and says she's seen the importance of that message. For example, she wanted to get young people on the South Side more engaged with the river and hosted a fishing event, but many kids seemed hesitant. So the next time, they started with just letting kids play basketball. Williams says they then naturally went down to the dock and tried some fishing, too.
The kids felt more welcome. There was something else that was familiar and was comfortable to them.
Meanwhile, local leaders are also advocating for environmental justice in an official capacity, like at a recent roundtable with the EPA. Newby-Alexander told the government representatives not to think about the topic as only greenery and scenery.
Because we keep thinking of environment as trees, bushes, and water. The environment is where people live. It's their homes. It's what surrounds their homes.
That's why the NSU team includes people from across disciplines, many you might not normally associate with the environment. Newby-Alexander teaches history and is leading the effort. Solomon Isikej is an MFA professor in fine arts. He says he wants to get people to look at any issue, including environmental concerns, with creativity and collaboration.
We talked about the needs to kind of redefine the narratives that are associated with, our watersheds and our rivers. And that became quite fascinating to me.
Back on the South Side, resident Jay Boone says she's hopeful the progress will continue.
Environmental justice is making sure that everybody has space, land, and able to do what they need to in those spaces to thrive.
She says it's as simple as clean air and green grass, but also goes a lot deeper. Catherine Hafner, WHRO News.
You've been listening to WHRO's Weekly Edition. We had help today from WHRO's Catherine Hafner, Nick McNamara, Ryan Murphy, and Michelle Hankerson. WVTF's Brad Kuttner and Michael Pope, and Jay Price with the American Homefront Project. Thanks as always to Connor Worley, who produced today's show. A reminder, you can always catch full episodes on the Weekly Edition podcast feed. You can get your news updates at WHRO.org and the WHRO Reports podcast feed. For all of us at WHRO and WHRV, I'm Doug Boynton. Stay safe. Be well.